it happened here. And of course that's what we've had ever since. We live in tower blocks, we have smooth surfaces, formica work surfaces, and we crave the rustic. But in doing that, we usually get the treatment of historic buildings over rustic looking. So, that is Stapleton near Bristol, and this is it's Kalundborg in Denmark. And what you see here is the red building is traditionally expressed with the structure, the muscle and bone of the building, the timber frame and the brick nogging in between being lime washed, being pulled together under a protective, weatherable skin. And on the right, it's been what the SPAB would call scraped. The structural elements have been expressed. And you can see the context of different wonderful coloured lime washes. And it's no coincidence that Scandinavia has a tremendous tradition of colour, tremendous confidence in architectural colour, because they've always kept their traditional mediums of lime for masonry and linseed oil for timber. Next. This is about the hierarchy of building materials, the hierarchy of wall surfaces, I should say. On the left is something fit for a pigsty and no more. There you have mortar, this is dry stone wall for a field wall, a pigsty here, a very agricultural building, low slated structure, where it's built with mortar, probably an earth mortar, which is not even brought out full and flush and pointed. There we have full and flush and pointed. There we have it with a coat of lime wash, and if you could afford more than white, you put some pigment in, and then you have the colour wash. And that's why in Pembrokeshire you have colour wash fronts and white ends and back, because they could only afford pigment for the front. And then on the right, if you could afford it, you plaster it. And the cheapest form of plaster and the most vernacular, common form is rough cast, because you're not having to sieve out the pebbles. The more sieving, the more sophisticated, because the more labour and the more pedigree the materials have to be. Next. And the lime cycle. Have we been through this? I'm going to do it very quickly. It's basically the burning of limestone in the quarry top, going around right, burning in the lime kiln, carbon dioxide is given out, then you stake it in a box, or you hot mix it, bottom left, 7 o'clock. That's the better way to do it. It's the most economical and labour-saving way, and it's probably how 95% of our built heritage was constructed, with mortar made in that way. If you hot mix, you certainly, that doesn't preclude maturing it. So the longer it matures after it did that wonderful chemical bonding together in the bonding of the quicklime, the binder, and the sands, that's the most important thing. And in putty, chemically it's the same, but physically we've come to realise in the last 10 years or so, it never quite holds together as a hot mix does. And then it's commercially bagged up and tubbed up and sold, and it's rather good. You can buy some ton tote bags or 25 kg, 30 kg plastic bags or tubs. And then it's used for bricklaying, plastering, pointing, as you're doing today. And then carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is setting it by combining with the calcium hydroxide, and it comes back, hey presto, to calcium carbonate, which is your crystalline structure of limestone. So you're actually making, in your plaster and pointing, a man-made, weaker version of limestone. And there's been a lot of talk about whether you can use lime on sandstone buildings, because it seems to decay. But I think really you could be safe in saying that decay is particular to sulphate crusts. It's to do with lime being seen above sandstone as it's washed down and decayed the sandstone, but not nearly as much as the sandstone is decayed here. It's much more about 19th century coal pollution. But sandstones generally, I would say, are more vulnerable to wetting and drying cycles, where they've got salts in them from pollution, as tin works here, or ground salts, or salt thrown on the roads and coming up the buildings through road salt from health and safety. So next. Lime production very quickly, you don't really need to know about this, but we were producing the weaker hydraulic limes, which was wonderful. This increased our palette from high calcium limes, which make the non-hydraulic lime. It doesn't set underwater, that you can keep in tubs or bags. And we had this lime which was more robust, more actively setting, and would set underwater. That's what hydraulic means. It means that a lime will set in damp conditions or even underwater. And Christopher Wren and his contemporaries knew about hydraulic limes, Arden lime from South Wales, and they were importing it for harbours and for foundation works and bridge abutments. And certainly by the time we get to Rennie and Telford, they were using hydraulic lime. And then we have cement being invented during the course of the 19th century.
Is that a shack?
That is, no.
Do you drive?
Yes, that's shack.
Yeah.
That is shack.
I often wonder what that place is.
Yeah, that's shack. And that was 24/7, and it's now rather sad to see just two kilns burning when I last went up. Yeah. So I really wonder, because of course that was relying on the steel industry. It was going flat out for the steel industry. Now we have almost no steel industry. The building industry is going to suffer, I think. I don't know. Anyway, this is producing very pure material, and we can't reinvent the wheel. We've learned about small-scale lime burning, but it's never going to be commercial. We need to be buying it from a kiln like this. And the trouble is, we're now buying all our hydraulic limes from Germany and France. Next. There's a traditional lime kiln, Carboniferous limestone in a Carboniferous limestone built kiln. Lovely. That's in West Cumbria, well, sort of west of Kendal. A pretty large kiln, that. Next. And that's a pastel by Gainsborough, no less, of lime burning going on. And it's surprising how often you find it being depicted by artists in the Romantic period, the English landscape period, 1750s to 1850s. Next. And this is a painting I did exactly 2 years ago, this time 2 years ago, of a Carboniferous limestone kiln in Ayrshire, just near Girvan, quite near the coast. And what was amazing was meeting a man who had known the man who had last fired this. The man was 80 and he'd been an apprentice to a chap who was elderly, so it was rather amazing to have that link. And that was discontinued, didn't have much of a life, it was discontinued about 1920, I think. Next. And there's my friend Tim Meek at our first Building Limes Forum gathering at Buxton, which of course is the epicentre of lime production, with a lime kiln where we burnt about a barrow load of lime with a coal fire. Next. And there's Tim slaking that lime, in fact, at the new National Trust of Scotland lime pits at Culzean Castle. Sadly, this wasn't used much because everybody went over to hydraulic lime quite soon after I had introduced lime putty mixes to Scotland in 1992 and 3. By 95, everything was going hydraulic. Next.
Go back.
Yeah. Now, aggregates. What do you do? Very good, you're thinking about colour. There we have down at Charles of Bristol a lovely old mortar mill, and we're choosing our colour. So, pink or yellow or a blend of the two. Next. And I've actually spent last week designing a mortar for Richard Welt over at just west of Redbrook, at Woolhope. And everything comes into the equation. The colour, whether you add charcoal dust or coal dust to give texture. Do you want to exactly imitate your historic mortar, or are you going to make something which is utilitarian and functional? Because after all, you're making a material which is carrying the building on in its life, so it doesn't have to, technically, it doesn't have to be the same. But I think we all have a feeling that we want to make it aesthetically similar. We want to make our repairs congruent with the existing. Particularly their small areas, small and piecemeal areas. If it's a comprehensive job, like Richard Welt will be doing, right across his house where he's unifying some really nasty, ugly recessed cement pointing of the 70s and you're literally going to fill that with the same mix. It really doesn't matter as long as it's a lime-rich mix using a good range of aggregates. It doesn't matter quite whether the colour is matching the original, but it's nice to. There's Bristol Cathedral in the background. This is on the Avon, back to the Avon, a man with an inclined banjo, a sieve, sieving his aggregate, which is dredged from the Avon. Next.
And what about the salt water coming in from the sea?
Well, quite. People did level it out on an inclined plane and let the rain wash it, or you couldn't let a river wash it or whatever, but it's wise not to have salt in your sand. Very good point, Sarah. The next thing is aggregate shape. Particle size is very important. Aggregate size always gets a nice continuous grading. Continuous meaning that you have a representation of every size sieve on your stack of sieves. If you have a very expensive stack of sieves, you shake the thing, a spoonful of, a shovelful of concreting ballast. It'll be sort of 4 mil down to dust, and you'll find most stuff will come in the middle sieves. The average particle size will be in the middle, but it's nice to have something represented on each sieve. If it goes straight through and is only caught on the bottom one, you know you haven't got enough course, and vice versa. But the other factor, and equally important, is particle shape. And for instance, a mechanically crushed stone dust is going to have a far sharper shape, or a quartz sand, which hasn't been geologically rolled and washed and windblown. That's going to be far sharper than something like this. This is the worst sort of sand. It's actually from Leighton Buzzard, and it passes the BS standards because it's the right grading size, it's the right particle size for the concreting sand or builder's sand or whatever. And it's fine with cement, which is a very short material. It's a very lean, short material to handle. Lime is very fatty, so it can operate, you can lubricate very sharp particles, very jagged, sharp particles, and it allows them to roll around each other. But what you don't want is these slippery, spherical ovoid surfaces where the lime can't get a grip on the particles. Any limestone is always better with lime because the lime actually forms it seeds crystallization of the crystallization that happens when your carbon dioxide is going and setting the lime putty, the calcium hydroxide, into the crystalline form of calcium carbonate. Next. And there's a sharp sand. There's a really nice sharp. That's called Angle Park. Rather good name for it. Angle Park, and it's actually sharp, angular sand in Scotland. Next. And then batching. What proportion do you want? And 1 to 3, I always ask immediately, what is the proportion of the binder? And that might be a hybrid mix of putty lime, non-hydraulic lime, and a hydraulic lime. It might be putty lime plus some brick dust, to Potsdam, etc. It doesn't matter. It's whatever you design, whatever you feel works, whatever works for you, and a lot of this is empirical knowledge. But repair mortars in the last 30 years have tended to be rather weak. Because putty doesn't have the same strength because it's half water, 3/4 water in that 30 litre tub, that volume. So if you're putting 3 of watery lime to 3 of sand, that's a lot weaker than 3 of quicklime to 3 of sand. Sorry, 1 of quicklime to 3 of sand, which works out in putty terms as 1 to 1.5, so double the strength. Next. And then treading. If you've got small quantities, always a good idea. If you don't have an expensive force action barren mortar mixer or the dough mixer type or a roller pan mill, go for Wellington boots. And this is a way of making a really stiff mortar. That would be the consistency for plaster. Next. And that's the consistency in a little tiny mortar mill that John Byrne owned for a while. And that is perfect for pointing. It's got that stiffness. It's been knocked out beautifully by the machine, and it's just ready to put on your hawk and point with. Of course, far too stiff to plaster with. Next. Cracking, why is that? That could be any of the factors that we've just been through not being correct. So I won't repeat them all again, but but that sort of excessive pressing, denting there with your thumb, with your finger knuckle, and that excessive cracking, that could be, in fact I haven't mentioned yet, is applying it too thickly. So it could be that. It could be that you haven't wetted up the stone enough. Or there's very, very rapid drying going on. A wind has got up, and quite often in March can be a vicious month for excessive drying. So protection is vital, and things dry up overnight. Wind can get up overnight, and you can lose a lot. That's why I was just saying to Bill Graham to cover up the work you've been doing today, because it's lovely work, and it's such a shame if that went too far by the morning. You can always tell because the edges go white, the little feather edges around the edge. So in the morning you'll be paring off. And probably, this is why line workers never can sleep, because you're working all day and night. Line doesn't wait. You've got to be there at the right moment, unless you can cover it up very thoroughly with hessian and plastic over the top of it. Next. This is a wall in Portugal, which was flush pointed. It's a wall of absolute rubbish. I love it. And with its round top, and you get walls like this. Kirkcaldy has got them in Fife, where it's built of absolute rubbish, like flint really. And they've used lime water. They've brought it up flush. That's all good. But can you see the trowel box? It's just been troweled on, liquid, and left. It's never been floated up. It certainly hasn't been protected. And you can see in the actual slide, raindrops ploshing in, so that there's been a storm, and then it's dried out. And then you get this, what you get, of course, with the runoff, without protection, and you get this blooming. The whole lot goes up white, because in wetting, it's washed out the lime, and then quick drying, the lime is sucked to the surface. It's pulled through the mix to the surface. Next. This is a wonderful dodge. This is in downtown St. Petersburg, mid-19th century terrace, one of thousands of terraces thrown up, well, hundreds of terraces thrown up very quickly to impress. Peter the Great started getting all the aristocracy to come and build their palaces in St. Petersburg and canals, and it's a second Venice. And so you have a soldier arch there, brick, and the whole entablature is brought out very rapidly in a massive block of mortar with great chunks of charcoal stuffed in. Now why? Because the charcoal is acting as an insulator against the ensuing frosts of the autumn, because we have a very, very short window of building opportunity. Late spring, early frost coming in October, and so they've got to be quick about it. You see the nails driven in to hold it all together. Of course, you see that a lot in England. I've seen it on Worcester Cathedral, and I've seen it on Badminton House, both 18th century work. Yes, and so that's just a very clever dodge to create insulation, but also to core out the mortar in a lightweight way. You could stick bricks in, but that would be too heavy and the whole lot would collapse off. The nails wouldn't support it. It's just a brilliant way of building out your lime mortar structure. Next. And here we have an incredible little scene, a sort of autobiographical scene on the ceiling of Sovdeborg Castle in southern Sweden. Men actually with larries knocking up, or they could be snaking, they're either making hot mix or knocking up. They probably are making hot mix because there's water in the background, and there's a man bringing a basket which could be full of hair. And so they're actually hairing up their mortar for making a plaster ceiling, so that the squelches of plaster squeeze through the last, and each little fib of plaster is gripping on with the hair in it, creating tensile strength. Next. And then there's a little sequence here of Tony Bowman and Tom Verity, Badminton House, 2004 to 5. We're actually rerunning mouldings in plaster. This is William Kent's work of 1748 to 9, just before Canaletto painted that facade, and the whole lot was actually painted with white lead paint, which is interesting, and that is what's in the Canaletto painting. But there we are doing patching. I love patching, whether it's stonework or plaster work. But getting your patches absolutely seamless. Right? I love the fag, don't you? He loved running cornices. He's running an easy one. He's just running a beam over there. And there's Penn Austin, building up a keystone with linties. Next. And there is building up rusticated coins. This is the ground floor rustication. Big stuff. These are big build-ups, and they were from the start. And what's interesting, I had them all to analyse, and it wasn't hydraulic. It had no porcelain materials in it. It appeared to be non-hydraulic lime, ordinary air-setting lime. But how did they make it so thick without it cracking? It is extraordinary. Great lumps of it. Next. And then shelter coating, basically lime wash with. Have you talked about shelter coating?
We haven't actually.
No. Well, it's basically a lime wash with micro aggregates in. So it's going to have silver sand, brick dust to help it go off and give it colour, whether it be pink or yellow. It's wonderful having yellow brick dust from the Cotswolds. And what else might you put in? Stone dusts. And Cirencester Parish Church Town Hall on the marketplace, that is a shelter coat, quite a bright yellow. Here we are matching the stone colour, and of course matching the original colours too. And it was very nice balancing between we made a slightly darker tone for the stone features and a slightly lighter tone for the plaster features. But the whole thing basically looking like stone when it's completed. And it was rather wonderful that when one stood back, it did look like stone. And people at the badminton horse trials came up to the Duke and said, well done, have you cleaned your building? Thinking it was stone. But of course it's all plaster. It's made of ticky-tacky. It's plaster on the lath, there's timber painted to look like stone. It's rubbish. It's lead painted to look like stone. There's old 18th century lead paint on lead up on the cupolas. They're all made of timber. They're pepper pots on top. Anyway, so there's a joke going on here while I was getting the pose for the photograph. Next. I've got to whiz through this. I'm way behind. That's downtown Pompeii. That's in the Forum Baths. Yes, some of the baths in Rome anyway. But showing beautiful stucco duro plasterwork. This is plaster that's got to withstand steam and mould. You know, this is right. Actually, no, it's in the locker room. This is the lockers. So it's not actually in the baths, but it would be in the more, the sort of more social areas of the bathhouse. Next. And then this is fascinating because this is the Roman tradition of stucco duro, hard plasters, but all made, because most of Italy doesn't have hydraulic lines, it has putty line, ordinary putty line, and they put brick dust with it. So these are at least life size, probably over life size, because it's high up in the Ionian baptistry in Ravenna. So this is mosaic here. Everybody looks at that. Nobody notices that they might look at the stones here, but these panels here are extremely rare to find plasterwork in the Dark Ages. This is I don't know, 500 to 550 AD, and you'll find a little thread of this work going on through, and then really nothing until the Renaissance. Okay, next. And there's cast plaster. These are cast elements here. That's been scraped in the 19th century, or it's fallen off and not been replaced. And then you have in the background mosaics, and a big slab. The abacus is stone, of course. Next. And that's in San Miniato, no, San Vitale in Ravenna, and the soffits of the arch, the intrados, is plasterwork, beautiful Vanso work. The capitals and pillars are stone, but you imagine the whole thing would have been plasterwork and with mosaics. So plasterwork was very much part of a Byzantine church decorating scheme. Next. High Camp in High Bavaria. Absolutely amazing. These figures are made on bundles of charcoal, and the whole thing juts out from that puto. That puto's arm has a wrought iron rod which goes through him and connects to the wall behind. So these two figures are completely supported through that cherub. Absolutely amazing. 1740s. Next. And then Pompeii again, showing the two types of, all made with putty lime, but this peppery mix here has got volcanic ash in. So that's got Vesuvius from a previous eruption. And the Romans exported millions of tons of volcanic ash from Vesuvius all around the coast of the Mediterranean for making hard mortars, hydraulic mortars. So I say they didn't have hydraulic lime, but they could make a hydraulic mortar by adding a lot of pots of land. So no sand, it's all volcanic ash. But the top coat is your lime putty and marble dust, because marble is even better than limestone dust for creating that crystalline structure, and of course it creates a wonderful light refraction, just like real marble. Next. And there's a system in, I think that was in, it's on the Aegean coast of Turkey, but it's a Greek period system with its flush corners. Lovely. And you actually, there's quite a lot of these are still working. You get batteries of them. I remember a battery of them in Tunisia. Next, on the Roman site. And this is a Toby John. This is, do you remember Great Wickham? The Millennium Project for Great Wickham. Toby built a lich gate, and Tom Verity and his colleagues decorated it, I mean, the floor, a genuine mosaic. And it was set in hydraulic lime. So there's a very good use of hydraulic lime where you're doing floor work. Next. And it's weathering very well, isn't it? I mean, all it's got is a layer of green on it and a few leaves that blow in every autumn. I mean, it's looking fantastic. And here is a complete cathedral tower built with lime. No cement at all. Between 2000 and 2005. And I've got slides of this all through its building, if only they were digital, but I've scanned some of them. But it is the most extraordinary structure. And yesterday I was at a wedding, and the architect, who didn't actually build it, but the architect who's in charge of Bury Cathedral, I stupidly forgot to ask him how it's weathering. But I imagine it's doing well. Next. There's a view, there's construction of it. Brick, interestingly, they used putty lime because the bricklayers found that hydraulic lime was too lean and short. I mentioned that. They needed something fluid and liquid for laying the bricks, and they used a hydraulic mix in the exterior skin, which was a harder stone, and the interior skin was putty. So that's a very logical way of working it. Next. Now this is a good use of hydraulic lime slurry. This is a grout. So those two, the lions and unicorns, a pair of lions and a pair of unicorns, put back. They were taken off in the 1870s, won't go into the details. This is St George's, Bloomsbury, London. Next. And there is Tim Crawley and his assistant Paul letting these stones out. They constructed the whole thing themselves. He came to tea the other day with his wife and said, yes, only the two of them put these up, these massive stones, and they let them down to little blue plastic 4mm joints, little squares, and then pointed up the clay and then grouted them. And they did look magnificent. Next, right, have I finished shot? Yes, there we are. A little bit of sweetening in to do on the joints. Basically, this is set with hydraulic grout. Next. So all lime again. Well, cement works. Yes, it does work. But look at the way it's going. Sinister implications. Yes. Next. And of course, interesting, we heard when the Duke of Edinburgh died that he and the Queen came to open this. He took a great interest in the building of the Forth Bridge. And it's a wonderful shot, that, I think. And what a structure. This is a brave new world, 1964. And fine for that. Fine for building nuclear power stations, but not so good for old buildings. But we all know this. Let's move on. I was going to say here, history of the use of lime. What was it? The dangers of using cement, as if we didn't know. Its incompatibility with soft, live old fabric, live in that it's moving. Its poor aesthetic, its environmental impact, both in production and in disposal. Here, thank God, it was never used. This is on, guess what, at Delphi in Greece. Why was it on the site of Delphi? Innocently rotting away under an olive tree. Thank God it was never used. But I love the name, Titan Cement, isn't that good? We all know it is Titan, it's strong, But the interesting thing, lime, though it's soft, is durable. The word duro, hard, actually is more applicable to lime than cement, which is brittle and actually doesn't last because it snaps and water goes in and we realise it's wrong and we take it out, and it's very difficult to remove it. Next. Also, it's very, there we are, there's cement in Syria. Rather wonderful that you see the cement plant, a rotary kiln, on the bag. Next. And this is what happens, of course. It makes brittle structures, makes a historic building into a brittle structure which snaps. It snaps through the bricks, through the historic building elements, and the joints are too hard. This is the settlement of a corner of a brick wall in Pembrokeshire, the castle in Pembrokeshire. Next. And of course the other thing is with cement, you can't recycle materials because they're absolutely bound together into a monolithic mass, and you have to jackhammer them to pieces and throw them in the skip for landfill. Although Team are now making lime mortars out of crushed up buildings, which is good news, as long as there aren't salts in the building. This is the risk. But all those bricks, people never question when they buy a second-hand brick that it actually owes its survival to being built with lime mortar in the first place. Next. Glasgow Cathedral wouldn't be standing now if it wasn't built with air-setting lime mortar, because the structure there, where those great ribs come down to that lump, that phalanx of ribs down there, that's very deep, and all in the piers between these diaphanous window mullions, those great piers, it's centuries for the lime, for the carbon dioxide to get through and set the middle. So as the building moves on its foundations, most buildings move within the first 50 years of their life, and then they settle up, they settle down. The thing is that as the building cracks, air, a little bit more air gets in through, particularly in the cathedral where you've got a lot of condensation. So you've got water molecules, which is necessary for carbonation. So you've got a nice sort of steamy atmosphere, enough to carbonate the next ring of still active lime in that structure. And so you get this phenomenon of self-healing and restructuring. So you can have a structure that's bent, but actually is structurally able. So if this had been built with cement, it would have snapped and rotated a bit like that red brick garden wall. Next. This is purely about the aesthetic hideousness of cement on the left, as opposed to the gently eroding lime between the flints on the right. Next. And then, of course, the pernicious activity, the action of cement, the wood, the end grain shrinking back, and the more it rots, the more it shrinks, the more it creates a pocket for the rainwater to go inside. And of course, the other thing about the cement in conjunction with stone is that it creates, because it's hard and dense, it's like toast on a cold plate. The bottom surface of the toast goes mushy where it condenses on the cold china plate. So you're having a physical reaction, which is depositing chemicals into the stone, and also you've got a chemical reaction of the sulfates in the cement. So it's pernicious in every way. Next. Villa Saraceno in Vicenza in Italy, you've got a lovely example of the spectrum of dampness, the rising damp. This is Palladio building cheap out of brick and mortar on a bog, basically, on the marshes around Vicenza. And you can see the buildings beautifully wicking out its moisture, the lime wash is showing up. One tip about lime washing, the more colour you put in the lime wash, the more you'll see that wetting and drying. So when it rains, it all goes dark and it dries up. And of course, when it's rising damp, but that's all right. If you can educate the client, if you can educate yourself, if it's your own house, where you see that discoloration of your coloured lime wash, that means there's moisture in there, and you just watch it wick out when the sun comes out. Next. Or you take measures to lower the water table in your wall. There are salts decaying the mortar rather than the brick. Every brick is surviving well. The mortar is decaying preferentially to the brick. So that's what we call a sacrificial material. Next. And there is poor Mike Smith having a sweat on the coach between looking at some Roman sites in Tunisia or Syria or somewhere. And
there the silk.
Wearing a silk shirt, when we were all wearing silk shirts in the 90s. And it's a wonderful analogy of a historic plaster, isn't it? The salt has migrated from the body into the outer layer, which you can think of as a lime plaster. All he has to do is to put that, have a shower and put that in the washing machine at the end of the day. All we have to do is to try and conserve our plaster, or if it's gone so far, we'll just remove the plaster and put a new plaster on. And that, of course, is what's been done over the centuries. And the very first slide of Stapleton Village near Bristol by Samuel Jackson, all those houses in that picture, except for the limestone wall in the foreground, which was purple pennant sandstone, all of those buildings were plastered. The church was white in the background, it was rough cast. All those buildings were serviceable with a replenishable skin. Next. That's why it's very difficult with a church like this, which is designed to be seen as a look at me, I'm a stone building. How do you pull it back from, are you able to render it? So it's one of my suggestions on the scaffolding was perhaps pare back the models of the stone and render it flush with the very fine ashlar dressings. That's one solution. This is classic of cotsworld, well in fact everywhere, all through the Forest of Dean I was seeing this long hope, flush pointing and lime wash. And the building has a skin, and it is exactly analogous to that skin on that silver birch tree. And it's just a perfect analogy, isn't it, of a bark of a tree which needs to transpire, it needs to peel as the trunk expands, and that is exactly what your lime is doing on your historic building. Next. That's what not to do. That's a plastic paint or a cement paint, and I'm dealing with a house at the moment, and I'm going with a heavy heart because really there's no way the client, unless he's a billionaire, is going to be able to remove all this plastic paint off a large house in Gloucestershire and redo it with lime and be purist. He will have to either go with kind paint or accept a very motley finish if he goes with lime wash on this can of worms. Next. So salt pushing through that impervious skin. This is just thrown in, this is a bit of bricklaying I did 40 years ago now, but showing the conservation approach where you just recess the joints just a little bit, having your irises showing. I tend now not to do this, I tend to be actually full and flush, just more subtle than that, so I don't have any shadow underneath each brick and each ledge a little. So I eliminate my ceilings and my floors between the joints. I like to try and get everything flush, but I don't want to bury the irises. I want to be on the level of the irises, as if it's a tide coming up and just covering the rocks. Next. And that's what you're usually replacing, or it has been replaced beforehand with cement, and you're now taking out the cement. And so I always say to people, look under your eaves, look behind, go up, if there's been an extension on the building, go up in the roof space of the extension and you'll find the original finish. So if it's a 17th century house with an 18th century addition, go and look up in the loft, and you'll probably find an early rough cast, a mud mortar, then you'll find this sort of thing, then you might find a 19th century struck pointing, and so on. So, you know, the history of wall surfaces is absolutely fascinating. Next. That, by the way, is poor man's tuck pointing. This is in Kilkenny, Ireland, and it's called wigging there, but it's what we call tuck pointing, because you're making a groove in a coloured mortar, which you colour the same as the bricks, or you put it as near as you can get to the colour of the bricks, and then you red wash it. Then you groove out while it's still soft, when it's literally leather hard, like Graham's lovely mix that he's doing on the bath stone. And then you groove it, and then you insert, while it's still leather hard, you insert a lime putty rich mix. And you can see those cracks there. They will be the original cracks. They don't matter, because if it's adhering well, the whole, it can work. But you do see it popping out on the cracks, at the cracks. Next. And there it is being done today, as a demonstration. You can see the self-coloured mortar there, being filled. Good show there. Next. This is what not to do, using angle grinders on very fine ashlar. All right, if you're very controlled with it, working with Johnny Anderson, gosh, he's good with an angle grinder. Oh, amazing. You can just cut to the line immaculately. And he uses a big one and a small one. He knows just what to do, and I pay him a fortune to do that work. But it's all right if you're cutting down a 10 mil joint, you can do. But these are joints which were 3 mil in the first place. So why were they doing this? Why did they need to do it? Shocking. This is Morton in Dorset, where the famous Lawrence Whistler windows are. Next. And just bad work, people not being trained to do, just ignorance really. They've been told to use lime mortar by the local authority. The wall hasn't been washed. The mortar hasn't been gone through its 10 stages of work. And I've got notes here, which I'm going to leave with you actually, which I used to deal out to the Autumn Trust lime mortar courses I used to do. Basically 10 stages that you can go through, varying sophistication. You can end up sponging all the work if it's that sophisticated and you're just doing small repairs in a very sensitive wall, visually sensitive wall. But generally, stages 1 to 7 are sufficient, where you're ending up paring back or brushing back and then lightly washing down the whole thing. But this whiteness can be avoided. Next. And then this is the difference actually, yes, between that had got to this stage. Do you see there's still a bit, this is really where you've got to out there, perhaps Graham's bringing it on a bit further, but you can see the initial cracking, or that might even be the second phase of cracking. Press all that in, really get it in. That's quite nice. Yes, I photographed this showing the pinnings going in there. Sometimes face bedded, but usually on naturally bedded if you can. Then that's flushed over level, and then pressed in. Then the time is allowed to elapse before you pare off and or brush off and or tap with a stiff worn out churn brush. Various different techniques. Everybody will have their own technique, but the achievement is to try and get a texture that's kind on the eye and that's absolutely flush. I haven't committed the crime of hiding any stone that deserves to be seen. So any surface that's with the wall face deserves to be seen. Anything that's bending back from the wall face shouldn't be seen. That's my basic rule of thumb. So I tend to tilt my mortars the surface of my mortars to a certain extent. But if it's a wall like this, which is pretty regular, then I'll try and keep the mortar plane level with the plane of the wall. Next. And in fact, that is the wall. It was I delegated it to Tom Verity, and he did a beautiful job, and it's Toby's Church, another of Toby's Church. Somerford Kane's famous Saxon doorway in the north of the nave, north wall of the nave, and it was thrilling to do that. And I realised that a lot of the stones are Roman, laid chaotically by the Saxons. That's not settlement, that's actually the way they were laid. And then we have some neat work related to the Victorian insertion there. One time you could read the wall, and I believe you still can read the wall with the way that pointing is done. It's absolutely flush as it can be to let the wall weather, so there's plenty of water to do with the breathing of the wall, and yet no stone has been buried.
And that doorway could be 600.
Really?
It's very, it could be
very early.
Very, very early.
Yeah, and they're definitely Roman stones which must be
Do you remember there was one we used for the sill? You remember we found a lovely Roman stone? And we put it in for the silver.
I've forgotten that. Yes.
It just slipped in as the threshold.
Yes. Where did we find the Roman stone?
Somewhere
outside,
round about, or in the bit that we dug out of the wall, the infill that we removed.
Yes,
somewhere.
wonderful. And what I remember very much, I think I've got slides of it, where the joints were going up against the returns of these stones, the internal returns. You could actually see diamond broaching, Roman broaching with a big punch chisel, that grooving, which is very classic Roman. You see it on Hadrian's Wall a lot, Hexham and so on. Next. Strencham, thank you. Brilliant. Strencham Church porch. You'll see the tower in a minute. In fact, you can see the trees are grown up now, but you could for some years see this wonderful yellow tower, which was blue lyres. And it was just unsustainable as a lyre structure. Very interesting, actually, in the context of your church here. We'll see it in a second. So there's the porch. Fairly a bit later, this porch. I think it could have been, I don't know what date this is, late medieval, 18th century sundial. And it was decided to plaster it. And the nave was plastered. And then the bullet was bitten, and they plastered the tower as well. It's a fantastic job. It's a Churches Conservation Trust building, so I think it is. But there was the usual politics with the parish, about whether they wanted to lose their beloved stone.
And back to local authority conservation officer.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. By the way, I'm very no conservation officers here. No? I'm really worried that in Cirencester, a really major feature in the streetscape of Gloucester Street, a big flank wall, south-facing, catches the light, and you see it as you walk up north. It's just been repointed to a sample panel which the a conservation officer in Cirencester Cotsworld District Council approved of. He said he wanted recessed pointing. It's hydraulic lime, it's not very well done. Forget that. It's the fact that it's the treatment of the pointing, it's actually recessed.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested to know that this is still being taught. This is still being advocated. Very interesting. And worrying. But there we are. So, I mean, the flank wall of my house, which is a similar feature as you go down, as you drive down Park Street, it is absolutely flush. And so I wonder what that conservation officer thinks of my thing. So there's the work finished. You see the plaster's actually allowing the coins to grin through, which is absolutely medieval. That's typical medieval. It's a hybrid between plaster and flush pointing.
And did you say you plastered the tower as well?
And then the tower, but look at it before, look at the state of it. The stones that are salient are oolitic limestone, they're guiting stone, they're sort of lovely yellow, durable stone, and then the recessing stone, the weak stone, is the lies, the local lies, sort of, it's River Avon lies. No, it is completed. I think it looks beautiful.
Was that Andrew?
What?
Was that one of Andrew's?
Don't know. I think it was
Nick
Andrew.
Joyce.
I can't remember.
Nick Joyce famously rendered the tower a live church, which is not a million miles away.
Yes, that's right.
But I forgot.
Where is Lye?
Lye is one of those villages near Deerhurst.
Oh, really?
That bit between
And that was Andrew's
Chippenham.
mountain.
No, that was Nick Joyce.
Oh, Nick Joyce. Is that?
Yeah. So
I can't remember. I just remember Trumpers were the plastering contractors. I know Jeff Walton was involved in this. But isn't it lovely the way it's very sensitive and subtle?
Yeah.
And it just reminds me to there, I mentioned Bavaria, go anywhere through the middle of Europe and you will see buildings everywhere like this. This is how Europe looks.
How did they avoid the scaffold lift showing through? They must be very clever plasters.
It's good. It's very good line washing.
The
plaster and the line washing. Indeed. Yeah. Very good point here. So often you see shuts between lifts, don't you? And splash marks and so on. One thing I really do wonder, perhaps this is a bit too conservative, wouldn't you want to replace, it's lovely the way it dies away, it's poetic, but is it functional? Surely the string courses are there for function. What's going to happen? You're going to see a stain going through there. You're going to see, that will, the point of the string course is to throw the water off every now and again. And it's not going to happen there, where the string course is missing. Anyway, on we go. Mortar repairs that I've done in Cirencester, they're actually surviving at ground level. The first metre up, they're not doing well because of road salt put on the pavements, splashing on pavements. This is work higher up. This is when before I started the magic addition of stone dust, I was using just sands, graded sands and lime. And fine, and also I was doing the completely unnecessary thing of gluing and resining in my linties. Absolutely unnecessary. They just need to be put in with a bit of lime grout because they've just got to have held in there by leverage. They're just going to pull off the mortar repair. So that was a mistake. But anyway, those are looking very good. Literally 30 years later, that was done in 1990, 31 years. Next. And there it is. Yes, I left the small lacunae here, and we just did the bigger ones. But there's quite extensive areas, and certainly on the coins you can see a build-up. Terrible image, but anyway, next. And there's rough casting. Again, this is not taking it all off, it's part patching. So parts are left, the whole lot is lime washing, and what I always do is to do a tack coat. If it's something that's going to be entirely covered and lime washed, then it's all the better to cover up your stone with lime wash, flick it on, because it gets into the crevices, So it's like the first seal, and it makes a beautiful tacky coat for throwing in your rough cast, pressing in your pointing, or throwing in your pointing, and then pressing it in. As long as you can see where you're going, but you can see the stone, you can see the first coat of rough cast, or what survived from the first work. If it was sound, if it's not loose, if it's sounding solid, if it's sounding like that, then you might be taking it off. Next. And that's the finished work there. Sadly, that next was a 1-to-3 with line putty, and it didn't last. And it's now been redone with hydraulic lime, but if it had been done with a 1-to-1 line putty, i.e. a 1-to-2 quick lime, it would have been robust enough and more equating to what the original would have been. The grey, by the way, is a grey lime wash on the. It's actually coal dust and black pigment. Next, that's in West Wales. And there's Picton Castle. That's where that red brick wall was. Picton Castle, Pembrokeshire. And they're very interesting. That's a mid-19th century lithograph, and it shows ongoing decay, usual problems, lead flashing, downpipes blocked, all the usual ghastly things that you do on your Funkonial Stevie. This house suffered badly with this sort of thing ongoing. And by the 60s, when the fashion was to remove plaster, they removed it, had a castle built of pebbles, the water poured in, and then Roger Capps came and rehardened it with lime in the mid-90s. And that's how it is now. It's back to this. Next, having had its scrape and cement phase. There it is, amazingly. I've got this record it really should go into a book, shouldn't it? I mean, all this, to live long enough to sort of see these buildings going through their different iterations. It is rather amazing how quickly buildings go through their different repair phases. Next. And the cost of it, too. Look at the cost of that. Wow. How many is that? 8 lifts. Next. Of course, the analogy between lime wash and the skin of us, our skin. Lime is the living, breathing skin of a building. It's also it's a barrier to infection, to pollution, the attrition of pollution and weather. All you do is just replace it, and we just grow a new skin. Next. And that's the side of my house in 2006, and it's looking very good now. And the lime wash is actually still sticking to the timber, which is good. That was oak there, actually. That was an oak birch rafter. Next. That's John O'Verity there. That's a house Briary Hill, between Gloucester and Hartbury, so along the way to the Trumpet, all the way to Ledbury. It's a plaster which had been plastic painted or masonry painted, not pipe plastic, but it was masonry paint, a mineral paint of some sort. And the windows had been repaired by a very enlightened couple who lived there. They'd done lime plaster around the window repairs, which is good because that's contiguous to the wood, so that lets it breathe. They couldn't afford to remove, and it is terribly difficult removing modern layers. So I just said, right, we'll lime wash it, and they'll put some acrylic in the lime wash on the main body of it, but just there, we won't put the acrylic in, we'll just use it so it can fully breathe there. And of course the problem is, I photographed this, I got there just at the right moment when it had been raining. It's dried out quickly where the lime wash is only its own thickness, so it's a few hundred microns thick, and of course the rest is bedded onto the wet lime plaster, which is wet because all the rain has run down into it, and it's now evaporating out. And within a few hours or a day, all that has come out and it's back to opaque, pale colour. Next. So that's what you have to ward against. And then these are buildings in the marketplace, how lime wash really does affect the environment. Here's the classic plastic paint with its mould of it. These are all plastic paints here. But it's interesting that even though they're plastic paints, they are still painting facades. And of course this is a great tradition. Cirencester, ironically, stone town, and yet marketplace buildings are mainly timber framed because they have to be replenished quickly. It's surprising how many of these are actually timber framed. Next. with stone flank walls and backs. And there's another view of it. And that lasted 27 years before being redone. Sadly, Rackham's is now gone, House of Fraser's gone, it's all derelict now, and the C&G became something else. But the new people did actually, resentfully, they did redo lime. Next. And then fresco, just briefly, the artistry afforded by lime, we know the technique, into the wet lime plaster you do your painting, and then the whole carbonates and sets the painting into the plaster. That's downtown Pompeii, a little sacred landscape. Next. And this is the Red House at Painswick Rococo Gardens, which I did in 1995. There was a lot going on that year. What I did, which was silly, was to not have faith in the one coat of red, which was purely pigment and water on the wet plaster, and it completely bonded, so much so that you could rub it like the skin of like you could polish a red apple. It was amazing. But I stupidly, Dalton process as usual, I did another coat of the colour wash on top, and that washed off, because the binding had already happened, the fusion had happened, and so this extra was superfluous. And it all ran down, and I had to, at my own expense, come and scrub all this
it did
red.
stain the masonry, did it?
What?
And it stained the masonry.
It stained the masonry, and all Dickinson got me to come and scrub it all off, which was a real bore. But anyway, I mean, it only stained these features here and that, because that was separate.
Yeah.
That was separate, yes, that was above it. So it wasn't too much, actually, and it didn't affect the seat. Anyway, next. I haven't been back there for years. This is interesting. Here we are in Rome. This is in Tonico, they call it, which is basically a white lime plaster with a lime wash on. And there you can see it washing away. So that's not a fresco, but that's very typical. And that lovely browny orange is typical of Rome. And that colour is now coming back again, which is great. Next. And this is in Copenhagen. Showing this is just plain white, but it's very interesting. They've done this as a pilot project. This town palace will be done. But this was a particular angle that I took it from. It was all white. This is white, but it just appeared grey in my Kodachrome slide, and the lime wash appears pearly, opalescent, light refracting, and of course that's what lime wash is doing. It's refracting as it goes in, and then as it comes out, it's bouncing out light. And I think that's, if only that was a really good photograph, that illustrates the difference between lime and the deadness of a plastic paint. Next. And this is in, this was either, I think this was Stockholm. Stone building with plaster on the upper floors, and that is water. So again, that's water. No, it's actually lime water and pigment. So it's a semi-adhering wash, which of course will wash off, and you can see the way in the rain shadow it's holding its colour well. Next. Very beautiful finish. Badminton, where purely by default, during the Duke of Beaufort, who took the place through the Second World War, it got into a very bad state. There was no money, but because we were very conservative, there was no money to wreck it, basically, to spoil it. So repairs were done in neat cement, but not many repairs, and this was the same as the house. So that great north front, which I worked on, was mercifully free of cement. There were one or two large areas, but they were contained. It wasn't, there was so much lime still there, purely because it had never been renewed. Next. That's the high street, and then that's the south of France. And they're not necessarily lime colours, but it just shows you, like the marketplace of Cirencester, that the painting tradition carries on. Next. And then my house in Cirencester, if you're colouring a townscape, one house might be a bit of a shock, two might be a shock, but if you can do three together, three is company, it just creates a lovely trio and just fits nicely in this. This is tragic, this is Bathurst Estate. I actually did this for them for a knockdown price because they would have gone on to do cement on there amazingly. They're still doing it. So this is pretty strong cement, as you can see, in a building that was the most beautiful lemon lime wash, lemon colour. Next. Worcester Cathedral, no less, when it was in its Norman period, was plastered, and with the joints ruled in, like you sometimes see in interior joints. They were actually ruled in, and not always corresponding with the actual joint of the sandstone ashlar underneath. But that's an extrapolation by the cathedral archaeologist Philip, I forget his name, from what was found in the crypt, from excavations. They actually found exterior lime plaster on Norman work that had been truncated, that had been stopped, buried, or whatever. But there was the evidence. Next. And here's Turner doing a lithograph of Morpeth in Northumberland, people working on a building, so it actually shows lime work going on, either lime washing or plastering. And what's interesting is that you see plaster on the castle in the background peeling off, and you see a building which is quite obviously stony and rather dilapidated. So there's a lovely feeling of the changing face of buildings. Next. That's 1805. This is a mid-19th century lithograph of Cirencester showing before, well that's showing before. By the way, that's damp in the paper and crack in the paper, it's not in the building, just to point out. I'd love a copy of that lithograph, I must say. Next. And there was a man lime washing in the building next door. So there it was from 1967 until I got the trustees to, that's why I joined the trustees, was actually to get the building line pointed. And so next. Oh, so there it was how it was, and now see how it is now. It's a very thin coat of lime wash over the top, and what you see, of course, is the architecture of the facade, such as it is. You see the windows, the door, you see the distribution of openings, and the stones are gently knocked back, and the ones that deserve to be seen, the coins, gently rimmed through. Next. And again here, more of the same really. That's a humble vernacular building that somehow escaped into the 80s. Next. And completely rebuilt. Next. And then that, amazingly, with its 18th century original plaster, got scraped when we had conservation officers. I don't know how it happened. Next, this is Malmesbury. This was a success story where the conservation officer actually gently encouraged the owners, one owner, to put back this had been scraped illegally, and then the conservation officer encouraged the inheritor of the scraped house, the new buyer, to put it back to the one that hadn't been scraped. So next. Lovely sash windows, beautiful sash windows. Yeah. So that's a nice job. Slightly rough cast, but it's all right. Lime, I saw it being done, and then lime wash. Rather nice, slightly different colours, so there's a feeling of different ownership, but it's all unified architecturally. Next. And then just near here, well, Krakow. I remember this in my childhood, we always used to drive down the A40 to Pembrokeshire. This was yellow lime wash, and now it is back to being lime wash. Next. And so there, it's interesting, it's now going back to how I remember it as a very small child. So on a sandstone building, on the roadside, facing south, it doesn't last long, maybe 25 years, and then another 25 years for it to wear almost entirely off, except for under the rain shadows. Rain shadows always keep the surface, the skin. Next. And this is the last slide, showing Loughborough Opera House, a complete, a sort of tongue-in-cheek building. It's made of concrete blocks on the cowshed and cement render and pastel paint, and I managed to get lime wash to stick to it by cheating, but then it's got a completely modern substrate, so why not? I just used dead flat acrylic varnish, which stage painters use. It's basically acrylic. They're very sophisticated acrylics, starting off with Unibond, but they were bond lime wash to a very hard impervious surface. And so you still have the effect of the lime wash. And of course, as soon as it rains, it goes immediately wet, but then it does dry out, and I found that it lasts quite well. I don't know how this is doing, because I haven't been there recently. Now there are just a few more slides if you want to see about mortar repairs, quite sophisticated repairs. Oh, there's the stone axe. And that's what it does, lovely tooling. So here we are, this is in Cirencester, Gloucester Street, I mentioned. This is the Money window. Sadly from the slide you can't really see, we've got the date, it was done in June 18. That's the very bad area of decay there. The mullion is edge bedded because it's a long length. You couldn't get a natural bed in that height. It's a big height. And there it is naturally bedded. We'll see in a second. So next. Good. Yes, that's just a detail of the lower mullion crumbling on the right hand side of it. The south side, interestingly. Because it's facing, yes, we're facing west, and it's the south side that gets the weather, right? Next. It says the upper surface before we started cutting away. Now, Toby, this is what I was saying on the scaffolding. You might just do some chiselling away. I'm not averse to doing this, as you can see. Next. So that's what I've done. Quite radical. I got right back to the good stone, just like a dentist will do with your teeth, drilling out the decay. So, you know, how he scarifies with that going down, cutting out the edge. I can feel it going on, and I sort of know it's doing this, and I feel good. Yes, the dentist is cleaning out the cavity. So there's some linters going in. I just placed them dry, I fit them dry. There's a long one, so I snap them off, but I'm usually using the butt ends, and not often that there's room for a complete T of the terracotta bronze. Next. Yes, there we are. They're all placed on the lower mullion. Obviously, you're using straight edge to make sure they're sort of. I like to get them about sort of 7 mil in from the top surface. Next. Yeah, close up of that. Next. Now we still can see the tack coat put on. This is just prior to filling. I intend to do the deep ones first. I wouldn't have tack coated that really. That comes in much after you've done the deepest first. You then do the shallowest, and then they're all drying up together. It's all about the volume of mortar that's got to dry out in the work time. You've got to plan your day, plan your week. Never be filling on a Friday if you're intending to knock off on a Friday evening and not come back on the weekend. Fridays are for preparing cavities, preparing work for the next week. So the filling really wants to be done on the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then you tail off on the Thursday and don't do any filling on the Friday, unless you want to work on the weekend. Next. This was a great job, actually. I worked very intensively on this. I worked 12 hours a day in a tremendous heat wave, very, very hot. And I had in fact, the printout, which I've sent online to Mark, so everybody will be able to read it. I did actually have a blue tarpaulin over the top to create shadow, and we were spraying it every 4 hours to keep it wet. And it was great that Paul was leaning out of the window and spraying. He could do it from his bed at night, Paul and Sarah. So there it is, building up. The mortars are now being pressed into the tack coat. Again, just like the dentist, he paints something on and then he squeezes in the filling. But unlike the dentist, who puts a little light on it to make it go hard, you are relying on the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to do that. That's why you need to slowly lift off the water, slowly reduce the water content. Next. A little close-up of that, just showing the accuracy of the work. The mortar looking very pale, of course, to start with, because of course, once done trials, you've done little cakes of mortar, you've floated them up, paired them off, or sponge. I just basically float and then sponge, and you can accelerate it by putting it in an oven, whatever. As long as basically you're just getting it to that stage where you can sponge off to get your finish. Next. So there's the work completed, probably with the final shelter coat over the whole lot, waiting to be. In fact, the timing is quite interesting. I don't stamp on by mistake, but actually I'm rather glad I had, because you can actually see what the time lapses between each stage. Next. And there's the work completed. That's the upper mullion. You saw the 3 areas, 3 lacunae lot, which have been dug out and replaced. Next. I'll tell you something of that. We've got evening sun. Yes, the sun's coming right round on the northwest. It's midsummer. You can just see the joint between the transoms there, the vertical purlin joint. I've actually run over it there with the mortar repair. I've just taken it over. Next. Oh no, I haven't actually. No, that's good. Oh, that's the sill.
Yeah,
Yes, that's the lower one. That's coming down to the sill. And there's the original stone, and there's the mortar repair. Brushed back. So it's been floated up. In this case, it was floating and brushing. I probably didn't pair it. I might have paired it a little bit. Yes, I probably did a bit. The best floats I use are pink insulation. Do you know that underfloor insulation? I've hardly ever seen it. I got a load from badminton when I was working there, and I've used it ever since. It's absolutely wonderful. I could have bought some to show you, to give you. Next. It's a limited resource. I really need more of it. So I think that's probably the last one. But that's looking really good now. I saw it this afternoon on my way here. Yeah, good. Is that the last one, I think? Just another, let's see. Yeah.
Well, you did go a bit mad, didn't you?
What's going on? I put in too many slides there, yes. So there's the whole thing. So we're looking at that window there. Is that one there? Yeah, good. No time for a swim in the wire.
I don't really do have. Well, thank you, Rory. That was very, very, very good.